Okay, so again, welcome. We're going to focus on Android and smartphone photography using an Android device. The phones are really capable of doing a lot of things, particularly landscape. The picture on the top is taken from an airplane with a smartphone as I was coming into Kootsmatine in British Columbia. And one of the things I really like to do with my smartphone when I'm traveling is if I'm sitting at the airplane window is to take lots of pictures from right outside the windows, and you can document your whole travel that way. But the phones do remarkably well for being limited and being able to do beautiful landscapes. They're getting much better at doing close-ups, particularly for identification. Uh, if you get cooperative insects or butterflies, there is a way to capture them. And what I'm getting more and more impressed with is rather than the long distance views from them is most of the phones now with the ones that have more than one camera have pretty good optical zooms on them, or the picture of the dandelion that's there, I took with an attached macro lens that I put on the phone. So the pluses of your camera phones is they're always available. People will always say, what's the best phone camera to have? Well, the one you have with you when something happens. So they're wonderful for being able to just pull out and photograph. I often, on a rainy day, if I don't want to take my other cameras out, I'll have my camera phone and I'll be snapping away in the rain because they're good in low light, they're good in bad weather conditions. They're becoming smarter and smarter and smarter, almost to the point where on some of the Androids I found myself overriding some of the automatic features. And they're great for sharing. I've been on hikes where I've taken a picture and as I'm walking, I'm editing it and then I email it home. So when I get home, I have the picture ready. Most of the smartphones are about 12 megapixels. That can be a limit if you want to do a huge print from a phone. That's just not going to be possible. And their depth of field is limited. There are things you can do to try to play with depth of field. Some of it that have limited zooms, and even with the new ultra cameras with the 5, when I was playing with the Galaxy 21, I found that the zoom close-up was better than the long distance zoom. There is even on the Galaxies, the newer ones, the ability to be able to zoom like 10 times into the distance. And I was able to get some bird pictures from it, but again, the close-up is better. And on every single camera phone, I never use the flash. I really wish that they would just eliminate it. There's no point in having a flash on these Zoom cameras. They don't illuminate enough. So you can do things, particularly next month as we talk about wildflowers, about bringing a light source with you. There are a lot of LED little batteries now that you can put several around a subject that you're doing and really light it. The flashes universally, I turn off all the flashes on the machines because they just don't have enough range. So the most important thing is with your camera phones, because they are limited in what you can do, is composition becomes more important and understanding what your story is. So in this little image, this story, this person decided was about the one tulip and not the whole field of tulips. I'm always amazed when I'm standing at a beautiful sunset and overlook, like at Shenandoah River Park, and people are holding their phones this way. They're upright. Instead of saying, it would be much more pleasant to turn it and do more of a landscape view. And that includes even with taking pictures of people and portraits. People tend to, for some reason, always hold their phones upright. So it's real important with the limitations of the technology to say, what am I really trying to photograph? This is an example taken with an iPhone of a bloodroot. And especially next month, as we start to get more and more wildflowers around, the trick about these phones is that if you point a camera phone, most of the times and most of the modes, it will want to focus from here to infinity. And it's really hard if you have anything in the background not to get, like on the top picture, you're getting the foreground leaves, you're getting the bloodroot, and pretty much you're getting the leaves and the stick and everything behind that flower. So one of the tricks that I find when I'm doing camera photography with a phone is to find a backstop so that the camera can't focus any further than in the bottom picture, the rock. So what I did is I got down low and I held the camera parallel to the flower. So there was nothing behind the flower except the rock. And that almost forces the camera to say, the only thing we want to focus on is that flower. It's very, very difficult. If you've got a lot of things happening in the background, that camera will want to include background elements. And there are some modes that reduce it. But what the camera's really doing with those modes when they filter out the background is they're putting a filter over it. They're really not doing what you do with a professional camera. So a lot of times when I'm taking pictures of leaves or trees, I'll just walk around until there's nothing else in the background that goes way far in a distance. And this picture, when you look at the bloodroot, the bottom picture, you can see the lovely little leaves that is so unique to a bloodroot that wraps around the stem. You can see the detail of the internal function of the pistons, the stamens, the middle of the flower. And so you can get detail with these phones. It's just sometimes a matter of positioning yourself in the phone. And next month, when we talk about flowers, you'll find that if I was going to spend a little bit more time, I would have removed the stick behind the flower. I might have left the oak leaf, but I tend to also clean up the little scene for the flower, not pull out anything that would be natural there, but if there's clutter. So you can create your setting, but you need to get close with these cameras. If you want detail, you need to get close. And that's another thing is I find people not wanting to get close to subjects. And so with your cameras, get really close and experiment. How close can you get to being able to acquire a good focus? And that's true with your regular cameras too, and your lenses. So I really was curious about what is really going on inside the camera. And so this was taken with my iPhone, and it was a very cooperative grasshopper. And you can see with this grasshopper, I'm taking it from an angle above, but look at that grasshopper's antennas. As you start to get out from the center where I purposely focused, you're getting blur. You're getting blur on the back leg, you're getting blur on the leaves. And that's because this iPhone that I had, it's an older one. It was actually at f1.8, which is a pretty shallow depth of field. It was 1/120th of a second. The ISO is 32 and the millimeters was 28. So it makes a nice photo, but you have to understand the limitations. And so therefore, when you're getting really close to subjects, and sometimes it's hard with insects, when they're cold, they tend to be a little bit more sluggish. But when you get really close, you have to be very cognizant of where are you focusing, because you're going to get blur, but the blur is attractive. It's intentional, but you have limits. So when you think about it, some of the cameras are at f1.8, some are at f2.2. How can you take a picture when you're standing on Skyline Drive and get the mountains almost to West Virginia and Ohio on a clear day? And that's because you're so far away from them that you do not need a lot of depth of field. If you were trying to, with your iPhone, get a really attractive picture of a tree and a boulder and the mountains all together, that you can't do. That's when you need a professional camera. But just taking a picture of a big scene because you're far away from it, that limited f-stop doesn't limit you from getting pretty landscape pictures. And they do a really great job with landscape. But just know, if you're used to camera settings, this is what's really going on inside the phones. And we're going to talk, because the Androids do let you manipulate shutter speed. They let you manipulate your ISO, which is the sensitivity on the sensor in terms of how much grain there'll be and how many millimeters there are. What you can't change is really the f-stop on them, other than simulating a change of the f-stop, because the size of your lens opening is going to stay the same. It just doesn't change that much. Now, if you have 5 cameras or 2 cameras, they oftentimes have different settings and they combine them. So a couple of first steps is that you need to update your software if you haven't, and a lot of times that's pretty automatic. The other thing is that those things in the back of your phone that you lie down on the table and you throw and everything, those are lenses. And if you've got the newer Samsung, they even have a lens protector that will clip over them. They may for the other lenses too, but if you're going to invest in the new Galaxy 20 or 21 with all those cameras and infrared in the back and everything, be careful of them, because if you scratch them, they're pretty sturdy, because my phone gets thrown around a lot and it's still taking good pictures. But if I'm going to use it as a primary mode for a camera, I'm going to wipe it. If I clean my eyeglasses, I'll take the same little lens cleaner and clean the lenses. Be aware that the worst thing on a lens, and this is true on your regular cameras, is if you put your fingerprints, because greasy, smudgy things on lenses make greasy, smudgy pictures. And then the other thing is the batteries are getting really good, and the Androids the battery life in the Androids tend to be better than the iPhones. But if I'm going up into the park where coverage is better now, but up in Shenandoah National Park, there's still parts on the drive that you don't get cell coverage. And when you don't have cell coverage, your phone is taking a lot of battery to say, where's the tower? Where's the tower? And so you can end up out without having a lot of battery left. So if you switch it on airplane mode, then you're not draining it, particularly if you're going to start using the cameras for video, which are real battery drainers. And you can have a little external device with you to be able to boost your battery power. In fact, I've got some hand warmers that are either electronic hand warmers or USB chargers. So, but be aware, and particularly, hopefully we won't get extreme cold anymore, but batteries, including phones, wear down in the cold. So the other thing you can do is, if you're using your camera phone, is while you're not using it in hiking, put it in an interior pocket to keep it warm and happy. So everybody wants to figure out how to get quick access to your camera, because the last thing you want to be doing is going into your camera or having something happen and say, where's that camera app? And so there's multiple ways on the Androids to be able to do quick access to your camera. And this is again the Samsung. On the Samsung, and I don't know if you look at your home one, if you've got that camera icon, if you swipe swiping on this one from the right to the left opens up the camera without doing any type of identification. Swiping from the left to the right does the phone. And that's a setting that you can do with in your settings. All the devices should have a quick launch camera setting. On some of them, you can double tap your power switch. And that's what this menu over here says. A double press of your side key will launch your camera without unlocking it. So figure out how to enable your camera on your phone so that you don't have to put in your password or put your thumbprint in, particularly if you're wearing gloves, and figure out how to get quick access to your camera so that if something's happening, you have it right there and you're not fumbling around saying, I know it's somewhere if I keep swiping. Or with the Android device I had, for some reason, because I'm not used to it, Android Pay kept coming up, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do Android Pay. So get to the point where you know how to get that camera without having to look for it on whatever device you have, and that will be in your settings. The other thing is accessories, and I really recommend having the ability to put your camera phone on a tripod. You can do incredible things if you have a little tripod with your camera. And what I have is, if you own a tripod already, here, this little device just goes on my regular tripod, and it holds the iPhone in it, and it's set. This part goes just right on my ball head or whatever device I have. Or you can just get one of the cheap little Gorilla leg tripods. I've got one of them somewhere around here. I don't know where it is, but I highly recommend it. It's a really good investment because you can run video so much better if you have a tripod, and you can put it on time lapse and do certain things, particularly when I was trying to get birds videos in the snow. And then I took pictures, I took video with the Android, with the snow falling. I did slow-mo, I did all sorts of things, and I was inside. I just put it on a tripod and backed away. So that's definitely worth doing. And again, if you own a tripod, you can quickly get a device that holds the camera phone on there. External charges, as I said. Your headphones are a trigger device. That's something I need to get. With all the phones, your power buttons is an alternative way of triggering the shutter on the camera. And I'll talk about that later. But I've been with, and they have to be the original headphones that come with it, the manufacturer's headphones. It can't be like another device. And what I will oftentimes do is I will sit with my headphone on and my camera like in my lap, particularly in certain countries where I wanted to do street photography, and it wouldn't be maybe the nicest thing to do culturally, but I really wanted to capture it, and I wasn't going to share the pictures. And it looks like I'm listening to the phone, and I'm clicking the volume button on the headset. The other thing is sometimes, like when I was doing some butterfly photography, I set up on the tripod. I have my headset cord, and I'm clicking the volume button to trigger it. Now I want to they sell little external triggers that you have to get for the model of your phone so that I can be inside and click it when a bird comes to the bird feeder. So those are worth doing because you can get more creative with it, particularly for night photography. Lenses, if you've got multiple lenses, they're becoming less important, but the close-up lens, if you don't have one on your phone, there's these clip-on lenses that are really great. And just don't buy a $9 one, buy a $15 one. And they're really, I've done a lot of flower photography with those lenses before I got the iPhone 11. They're well worth it. And if anybody wants a recommendation, I can do it. They just clip over your lens, and then storage devices. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The one thing I have discovered is that if you use your USB port and you plug your camera in and you allow the camera to trust the computer, if you look at the directories, just like on your phone, there's a DCIM directory, and that's where your photos and videos are, and you don't have to use the cloud. You can go through them. You can look at them on the screen. You know, it's a really good thing. But if you were on a trip and you didn't have a computer, there are storage devices where you can offload things from your phones. So the problem with phones is that they tend to accumulate a gazillion pictures. So you need to delete. It's sometimes painful, and one thing that I don't do often enough. But you know, the other night when I was sitting watching television, I was sitting there trying to delete the multiple pictures I have. You know, it's really fun to take a picture of that wonderful dessert that you had, but you know, 3 years later, do you really need a picture of the dessert? You know, but they're clogging up your phones. You can back up to a cloud service, and your phones are set to either do it automatically, or you can choose to do it. I tend to want to choose to do it because I don't want it backing up, particularly when I was doing more foreign travel. It would be a real problem for your phone to start triggering backup, and all of a sudden your cell charges are astronomical. So I tend to not automatically do it. And with your Android devices, because they're Android, use Google Photos. That's the best backup you can do. So that really does help. So the other thing is you can transfer to the computer. iTunes shouldn't be on there. That's an Apple specific thing that I didn't catch, sorry. But the other thing is ScanDisk and this little device called the Hutu. They plug into the device, and you can download your pictures directly to the device. But just hook your phone up and look for that DCIM folder, and you can access your pictures. But do delete. So if you haven't done the Google Photo app, go to the App Store and do it. If you have Android devices, chances are you all have a Google account, because that's the way that you go to your store to get more apps. And it's a really good way of storing pictures. And if you just say that you're going to store them in their lower resolution format, which the phones are fine for, there's a lot of storage there. We've been using my Google Photos site for uploading pictures, and I still haven't exceeded my limits on that site with all the uploading that you all have been doing. So highly recommend Google Photos, because what can happen is you can have that phone, people drop phones, they break phones, those pictures of your pets, your grandkids, your kids, they all disappear if you haven't backed them up. So it is really important to get the pictures off devices. So let's look at a little bit, and again, everybody's phones may have some different icons. This one is the Android. And I don't know if on your phone, when you bring up your camera, if the camera setting button is automatically there, but that is a really nice feature of the newer Androids, is that you can go right from your camera to your camera settings. On the Apple devices, you have to go and look for them. But the camera settings and going into your settings and knowing what they do is really important. And I'm going to go through a few of those, but that's handy to have. Again, the flash I don't know, maybe if you were taking pictures of a birthday cake or something, it might be fun to put the flash on, but 99% of the time, just make sure your flash is off. Um, a timer is really helpful to do group pictures, to do night, there is a timer. On the Android device I had, that little 3:4 is your resolution, and what was offered there is the 3/4 on the new Android is a whopping 40 megs, but with that comes a lot of downside in terms of needing storage, and the bigger the megapixels, the more distortion you're going to get if you have movement, although there's stability in these cameras now. And then they have 1:1, which is basically a square, 9:16, which is the resolution of your television, and full filled the whole screen. It was it's like the home screen. And then your volume buttons, again, they're really handy to have as shutter controls. And the reason is, particularly if you're doing landscape, it's very awkward to hold your camera phone and try to get to that shutter button that's down below. The Androids also have a feature where you can have a floating shutter button, and that can be anywhere on the screen. I found that to keep triggering things accidentally. So I don't set that function. I use the volume buttons a lot as a shutter. And so sometimes when I'm setting it up on my tripod, I make sure those volume buttons are up there, and that's what I'm clicking to control the shutter. It gives you a lot more control in terms of where your hands are than trying to reach and get to that shutter button. On the Android that I had, it did have a little focus button. It had these different zooms, and I don't know how many of your phones have something called scene selection. That was a pretty amazing little thing that kept popping up on the newer Galaxies. And it sort of, you can see there that I had flowers, and it knew it had flowers. So more amazing, I took a picture of my cat, and it knew it was a cat. It had a little cat symbol. Now, if I took a picture of the cat not at the head, it thought it was a dog. Now, for the life of me, I don't know what it's doing differently if it thought it was a cat versus a dog, but it has all these incredible number of different scenes that it thinks that you have, including mountains and trees. And I can understand some of what it's doing in terms of adjusting its focused area. You can also turn that off, both in the settings and by clicking on it, so that you can control it instead of the camera controlling it. So that was just something, I don't know, again, if you've got in the auto mode, if you're seeing these different scene icons coming up. But the high-end new Galaxy was pretty remarkable in terms of recognizing what it was looking at. You can also access, after you take a picture, you can go to the gallery, and the little arrows back and forth, or whether you're taking pictures with the front camera or the back camera. And the front camera usually is more designed for selfies. And of course, that's the shutter button. And then also, if you click on some of these different icons, different things come up. And if you want to get from photo to video, if you're on video, this little arrow caret would get me back and forth. So on the newest ones, I don't know, this may be very specific to the newest Galaxy. It has this single take, and it gives you 10 seconds to shoot a scene from different angles. And I tried it, but it didn't seem to have a really important function for me. I don't if I'm going to take 10 different pictures or 3 different pictures, I just want to purposely do it. I didn't find that to be of much value. People may find it differently. When you're in photo, you're in this auto mode, and it will do its best to pick your scenes, and it's almost like being in a point and shoot camera. Video, you know, there's, again, each of them will have different resolutions, and I'm going to talk about video and video resolutions a little bit later. And what I'm going to talk about will also apply to your full body regular cameras. And then I think all of the Androids, one place or another, has an ability to get into different modes. And this is important. They may not have all of these, and some of these, again, to me, are not most important. And some of them you can also, with the plus sign on this Android, you can have that mode be down below next to photo video. You can tell your setup, which one do I frequently use and want to have more readily available. Again, that may not be on all of them. So some of the important ones is the Android Pro mode is an important one, and I think all of your camera phones should have it. Panorama, I tend to, if I want to do a panorama, I tend to shoot it and then crop it panorama. I have a problem, it may be me just sort of moving and keeping things from getting distorted, but you know, people like, and you can play with the panorama. Food mode, I'm going to talk about later. I finally discovered what it is. Most of the new cameras have a night mode, and I'll talk about that. Portrait mode, I'm going to talk about that one too. And this one has a bunch of different video modes to it. And hyperlapse is a timer that you can try to use at night if your cameras have it. So we'll cover some of these different modes. So getting back to composition, this was taken with a camera phone. And the reason that composition is important on this is, again, it's limited. So my focal area was on the spider, but I used the leading lines, the spider web to attract in, and I put the spider in one of the areas of the sort of rule of thirds. As you can see, the spider sitting there. So one thing you can do with all the phones is you can go into your camera settings and you can have your grid lines show. And I do this on the phone for 2 reasons. The grid lines are useful for composition. The other thing in settings, and again, you're going to need to look at what your features have, is that in this phone, in these settings, and I had to scroll through to find them all. There's a couple of ones. One of them is swipe the shutter button to take burst shots. And I don't know if that's in all of your phones, but burst mode is a really convenient way of doing it. So if you have a way on your phone to set something that allows you to take a burst of pictures, that will help if you have fast moving action that you're not videotaping. Another thing on the Androids I learned is that if you have the option, and this may be only on the newer ones, at the bottom there where it says selfie, color, tone, natural, that's a default setting, and that's important to do, because I found that in the older cameras, some of the selfie modes, they were oversaturated a little bit. They were trying to do a beauty mode, but it was changing the way people looked. And so if you have the option in your settings, definitely do your selfie mode neutral, and you could try it the other way and see if you like it. But I found it was a little bit distorting. I'm also going to, on the left side, I'll talk about the auto HDR a little bit. And that one is naturally, its default is usually on. So if you have your grid lines set, the grid lines also have and again, this is on different models, they have a level in it. And so if you've gone into your phone and you found your grid lines, the way the level works, at least on the Android, is that if this phone was not level, and this would be, I'm trying to shoot, holding the camera over something, and I want it perfectly parallel, a square with a little ball, almost like the level on a tripod, or a level on a leveling device that you would use for carpentry. That little ball will be white until it gets into the center circle. And the reason this is important is because when we start to do wildflowers with the phones, the more level that you hold your phone, parallel plane of focus, the more depth of field you'll get. If there's a tendency to hold devices on an angle, and this little leveling device won't come up unless you're holding it down and the cameras are looking down. But it's really handy to have, because if you're trying to get that center of the flower as much as possible in focus, the more you tilt your camera, the more part of your camera is further away from what you're trying to take a picture of. And this is true too if you're trying to scan a document or do anything that's on a table. So set your grid, and if you have a leveling device, use the leveling device. It comes in handy. So a couple of things, this is my backyard from my deck, is the high dynamic range. HDR is not high definition like on a television, it's high dynamic range. And it is handy to have that auto setting. I could not find, if you turn it off, I couldn't figure out how to turn it on just for one picture. So unless I went to settings. So I recommend having it on. And what high dynamic range will do is it will expose usually 3 different pictures. So it's exposing for the darker shadows down below, it's exposing for the mid-tones in the trees in the middle, and it's exposing for the sky. And I purposely shot this right at the sun. You can see there's a glaring sun. And it did pretty well, being able to deal with all the dynamic range that's in this picture. This is a pretty bright picture. And then if you are in the photo mode and you have the option, in this one, it knew that it was looking at a landscape or a mountain view. Again, that was fine with me to be in the auto mode. But if I clicked on that little mountain, what happened there was this little mountain turned into this sort of little star area. So that's how you can do scene optimization on and off. And also on the zoom on this one, I was as wide as I could be. So I picked the zoom. I can zoom with this particular model, I could zoom closer and closer and closer. I found when I went to the most zoom, I lost detail. It became more pixely. Again, here's some examples of this crazy scene selection that kept coming up and was pretty accurate. So when I was taking pictures of the sort of flowers, it knew it was flowers. When I was taking pictures of the mountains, it knew it was mountains. When I aimed it at a tree, it knew it was a tree. And when I aimed it at the cat, the little cat came up. And the cat sitting in front of the window is another example of why HDR works on it, because I've got a really dark cat and a very bright snow scene behind it. And it was able to pretty much handle both of it and also know it was a cat. So again, that's the more advanced Galaxy. That's That's pretty good. And particularly a lot of times with your camera phones, you just want something that you can whip out and quickly take a picture, and that auto mode does a nice job. It also had a text mode. Um, and this was sort of fascinating. It recognized that this was text. I could tap to scan it. And if you have this mode, it will convert it to text too. And all of a sudden now you've got the document as text. So that was pretty fun. So auto HDR, I recommend on this having it. If you get to a setting where you don't want it to do that because you're trying to manipulate it, you can always turn it off in your menu, but turn it back on. And this is a sample HDR that I took with an iPhone, and you can see it's really doing a good job of the shadows, the midtones, and the clouds. And it did a pretty good job of the detail of the rocks and the wall on the drive, and also the mountains. You know, it's pretty. I'm pretty happy with it for what it has in terms of capability. And then this is another example of why HDR works. And this was with my iPhone. I took it with and without, and it's pretty exaggerated. But you know, if you don't, you can either have your midtones or you can have your background. It's hard to have both, and it does a really good job, the HDR. Whatever way you can figure it out, you need to figure out how to do burst mode, because here you have adorable baby monkey and bunny. They're all lined up and they're wiggling all around. And the best thing you can do is burst mode. And on the newer phone, I set it in the menu so that burst mode on the trigger button, I could slide it down. And then what was happening is it would turn from white to a red, and then I was getting a count inside that white area of how many pictures I was taking. And the other way you can set it is so that your side button, one of your side buttons can be your burst mode, but you need to find out in your device how to do burst mode. So because your shutter speed is going to be somewhat limited in auto, and you just don't know what's going on. And then instead of one picture to pick from, I have 10 pictures to pick from. And so that makes it really handy, particularly if kids are playing sports or running around, the dog's jumping, you know, burst mode can work really well. And what happens with burst mode is when you click on the picture, that picture before showed you there were 10 of them. I click on that picture and it allows me to pick which ones I want to keep. So I go into my gallery. I find the picture with the burst mode. I say, they're thinking this one with the crown was the best one, but I want these two. And I'm going to tell it, then I hit this down arrow, which is my save arrow, and it asks me, save the 2 pictures and delete all the unselected ones. So the great thing about burst mode is you can get a better picture, particularly if we're doing wildflowers and the wind's blowing, and you know, so you burst mode over that because you hope one of them, the wind stops blowing. But to keep your camera from filling up, you need to go in and then pick the ones out of the burst mode that work the best for you, and then save those. So burst mode's really, really handy to have. So your cameras will have different zooms. On this one, there's the options on the newer one with 5 cameras is that the wide angle was 0.6. So it's half of what the normal view would be. 1x 3x, and then 10x. And as I said, I was not real impressed with the 10x. I felt like the range was better before it got to 10x. And most of the cameras don't have that. If you have a zoom option on your camera that is like this, like 0.6, 1, 3, 10, whatever they are, those are where your cameras are set, and those are more fixed zooms from the lenses. If you pinch or have a dial that's in between, what that's doing is it's pulling the pixels apart. You're not getting more pixels. So if I went over 10x, or if I went to something, if I was on 3 and I zoomed it to 5x, what I'm really doing is taking the 3x camera and I'm pulling pixels apart to make it 5 times closer. My recommendation is to stay with whatever the set zooms are on the camera, and don't do the in-between zooms, because all you're doing is pulling apart pixels. It's far better to take the picture at whatever standard zooms your camera has, and then after that, crop them. Or if you have an older camera, get one of the external lenses to clip on, because you're going to get better resolution. So that's a little bit about zooming. So the pinching thing doesn't work real well. What you're really literally doing is, if you had 10 marbles, you're pulling those marbles apart. And so now you're going to get gaps. So stay with whatever zooms your cameras allow, but play with them and see what looks good for you. This was with, again, the 3x zoom. That's pretty, I found the 3x to be really good. If I had a 3x in this Galaxy, that's probably what I would do flowers with, because to get that sort of resolution on this beat up old penny I had is pretty good. And you can pinch it and look at it, and it holds up. But with your cameras, just play with it. Just take a picture of something like this, like a penny, and see at what point do I get enough detail that I'm happy, that instead of, and this is cropped, it's not, it didn't fill the whole frame, that I'm happy that I'll get detail, because doing flowers with cameras is really helpful to have. So the other thing you can do with these cameras is to have and decide what the focus point is. If you go auto, it's going to decide what your focus point is. If I do auto with a cat, it's going to look for the head. If I do auto with the mountains, it's going to focus wide. But you can override that even in the auto mode. So why focus points are important is that on this fungus, and again, this is with my iPhone, I decided my subject was the fly. And so I focused on the fly. And if you really look at the fungus in the foreground and in the background are a little bit, are a little less in focus than the fly. I made the fly the story. Same principle of looking for a scene that didn't have a lot going on behind it. And I didn't mind that the back fungus blurred out. So on your cameras, on the Androids, the way the focus works is that when you tap on the screen, you'll see a white little circle with a lock on the top, and then you see the little sun beneath it, and you can focus on it. So in this instance with these flowers, I decided that I wanted my front flower to be the primary focus area. And this is the number one thing that will improve your use of your camera phones, no matter what model you have on them, that being able to focus. When you hold your finger on that area and you can see it on the screen, there's now a golden circle and the lock is closed. That will lock it so that even if, say, I wanted to focus on that flower, but I wanted to move my camera, I can move and it holds that focus so I can recompose, or I can take my time to do the picture. If I only tap it and it's white and I'm thinking about it, it will go away and it will revert. And it is controlling both focus and exposure. So if I'm tapping on the bright sky, you'll see it. If you start tapping around, you'll see that it gets darker and lighter, depending also on where you tap. If you've got a scene with a bright sky and a darker foreground. The other thing you can do, and we'll talk about this, is slide that sunny little thing up and down to change the exposure and darkness or lightness of your scene. So the number one thing you can do is control that focus point by tapping on there. To unlock it, you just tap that. My nuthatch, sorry. You just tap it again and it will unlock the exposure and the focus point. And you can do an experiment. You can now see, if you line up two cans on a plane that are apart from each other but are on an angle, if you tap and focus on the front can, you'll be able to read that front can. You will not be able to read the text on the back can. Subsequently, if you do it on the back one and not the front one, you're now changing your focus point. This is how you can control depth of field. You also notice that I put a black background behind the cans, so that same principle of having that backstop, so your camera's not trying to focus way off into the distance. So experiment with controlling your focus points, because that makes a huge difference in terms of having creative control over this camera that is also your phone, your lifeline to the internet, your research tool. Now you're starting to use it and control what it is, what your story is. Exposure also makes a big difference in this example. And there's no right or wrong on this one. On the top one, it's exposed light and you can see a lot of detail. If I want to emphasize the water drops, I can darken the exposure. And darkening exposure, particularly around sunset, can really make a more dramatic scene. So the way you can deal with your exposure is you can lighten and darken it in the auto mode once you have this little sun that comes up, and it's a matter of just sliding up and down on the screen. And you just have to get used to, every screen's going to be a little bit different on how you can adjust it. And again, if you hold it and have that lock on it, it will lock, and you can move around and it won't change. If you don't lock it, it will go away after a certain time. But again, changing how dark or light you want that to be is another way you can creatively control your camera phone. So most of the newer cameras have a night mode, and they're pretty awesome in terms of figuring out how to deal with low light situations. What it will do in the night mode is it just increases how long the shutter is open. And so you have to hold your camera pretty still if you're in the night mode. But this is a demonstration from the Samsung site. There are times though that I override the night mode. If I want to take a picture of the moon, I don't want it bright. So you can turn it on or off, but it will try to brighten the scene when you're in night mode, and it will tell you it's a 3-second exposure, or it will tell you how long your exposure is open. And this is an example of the night mode from the Galaxy, and this is handheld. If I had taken a little bit more time and put it on my tripod, I think it would even be a little bit better. But you can definitely see this is the Orion's belt, and this is the warrior's sword coming down. You can see the constellations and the different stars. So it is pretty awesome. What I did is night mode, and then I darkened the screen on this one. So I don't know if you have a food mode, but I decided to override the flower mode and do food mode on it. And what food mode, and the reason I bring it up, because if you do have it, it might be fun to play with it when you're doing some flower photography. What it does is you'll see a square come up, at least on the Galaxy. So it is purposely only focusing and is blurring out things to the side. And it also is giving you more saturation. It oversaturates the scene a little bit. But that can be really awesome with wildflowers. And so what I always try to do is with these different modes is figure out what are they really doing. And again, I don't have to take a picture of that awesome dessert with it. I want to use that mode and what it's doing to highlight flowers. So again, play with the modes and see what they do on your camera, because that actually was like, I can make something out of this, this. And because it's really hard on the other modes to get the blur on the sides, and it's like, okay, food mode, that's pretty awesome, but I had to override it and tell it I wanted food mode. And it tends to want to do food mode even sometimes with flowers when you're holding it parallel to something, because it assumes you're holding it parallel to a plate. So so pro mode, and I'm hoping everybody has a pro mode on their camera, because I think most of the Android devices I've ever picked up, even the older ones, have a pro mode. And what you can do with them and how much you can set them will vary. But in pro mode, you can set the ISO. And if you don't have a pro mode, there are apps you can download that you then allow the camera to talk to that app. If you own Lightroom has a pro mode that's free. It's a free app that with your Adobe already subscription. But there's a lot of different apps. There's one called Pro Camera. And what it's going to do is it's going to simulate different situations. So you can change the light sensitivity in the newest Galaxy. You can change it from 50 to 3200. You can change the shutter speed. And the reason this is significant is if you want to do waterfalls or slow shutter speed, you can set it to 30. Or it had an awesome shutter speed of 12,000. You can change the shutter speed if you're in a sports mode. You can do white balance. I would adjust white balance afterwards, but if it's a sunset, you can go into the white balance and you can make it more red if you want. And filters. I never, ever, ever use filters while I'm taking pictures. I do filters later, because why put a filter on it and I can manipulate it after the fact. I'm going to talk about the other two, the automatic focus and the exposure on the next screen. But, pretty much you can go into full manual mode, or you can use one of these different settings at a time. So one of the ways that we did exposure compensation was with that little sun that came on the screen and you slid your finger up and down. But you can also go into pro mode and you can click on the exposure plus or minus, and then another scale comes up and you can slide negative or you can go plus, and that will be either make it darker or lighter. So that's a pretty handy thing to do. Do know that if you set it, the next time you come into the pro mode, it holds those settings. There are some times in the camera setup that you can say reset to before, but also know that it is, but you'll see it because your screen will be darker. So the exposure compensation, again, is really handy, particularly if we start doing some flowers, and I always will exposure compensate during sunsets. The other thing this had was an automatic or manual focus on or off lock. That was a little more complex to use, but it would come and you could then focus either manually close up or at a distance. The thing I would use most in your pro mode is your shutter speed and your exposure compensation. Those are available there. And what will happen is if you are only doing one element, it will adjust the ISO. It will start adjusting other things to make it come out so that the exposure is working. So here's an example. You can also do your lock. That whole tapping of the screen works in the pro mode too. And you can do your automatic focus and your automatic exposure. You can lock it, and then you can move your exposure compensation back and forth. And that way, again, you can recompose. And so here's an example of using the pro mode with some flowers. And what I did is on this one, you can see on the left, that's before I did exposure compensation on the flowers. They're bright, the background's pretty bright. And what I did is I just brought it down. So I darkened everything, and I probably changed my angle a little bit. But, you know, for a camera phone, I was pretty happy with being able to get the focus on the front flowers. Again, I tapped that front flower. I purposely said, I want my focus over to the left, not in the middle. And then I darken the whole screen. So you can get creative with these different settings. Portrait mode. Most of the cameras have a portrait mode. What they do and how sophisticated they are have changed over time. When you're in portrait mode, it will look for a face and it will tell you when it's ready. With portrait mode, a couple of things. You need a lot of light for portrait mode, and you need to, it will tell you what distance you can be from the subject. And the reason that is that a lot of the portrait mode is combining pictures from two different of your cameras. And so you need to stay within 3 to 5 feet of the subject. I was too close to my subject when I did this bottom picture. But it will prompt you of where you need to be. And when it's ready, it will tell you it's ready to go. And what the portrait mode's doing is it's going to focus on the face, and different parts of the portrait mode, you blur some of the background. So on this camera, it had a bunch of different filters. And if I press the circle, these different crazy filters would come up. It could be black and white. It could be a number of different things. And the amount of the filter too was different depending on how much you slid underneath the filter, how much you wanted it that way. So it allows you to start to do some filtering. And this even had a mode where you could make everything black and white except for the baby's face. It just has a ton of different little options that were in there. So here are all the different options. There is studio mode, which is gives you a nice side lighting. The blur mode, which blurs everything except the face in the background, and you can slide back and forth on how much blurred mode you want. And then it has this background mask thing where on the right-hand side, the baby, I set it sort of a little bit, and then I set it extreme, and it looks like the poor baby is floating in Pepto-Bismol. So with any of the filters, you just have to be a little bit careful with them. But the thing with portrait mode that I always find interesting again is I sometimes will take my flowers using portrait mode because of being able to do this type of manipulation. And the portrait mode allows you to do these filters while you're taking the portrait mode or afterwards. They also, this one, I did these after capture. The same thing came up is I was able to go into the gallery. When it's on portrait mode, these different filters can be applied afterwards, and only if you've taken it in portrait mode. And so what the filters do is they come up with these different dots. So one of the ones is selective color. So you can make everything except for the scene and the amount. You can make the flowers color and the back black and white. And then they have these crazy blur ones. So there's a natural, the first circle was a natural blur and it just blurred around. But then I'm like, oh, what are these other filters down here? And they've got like ones that zoom in and out, and then the upper one's a spin one. So you can get really crazy with them. But again, I always want to do my filters after capture. So that was the end result of taking pictures of a flower, then going into the gallery and being able to access the blur mode and then put a like crazy spin on it. So again, if you've got a portrait mode, play with it and see if that's something you want to do outside with your flowers. And then you can always, again, I always go back to this selective focus as being your primary tool that can help you. And so you can create this feeling of depth of control by going into portrait mode and then clicking on the first picture on the left. Obviously, I picked the monkey's face as the prime area of focus. And I didn't care about baby and bunny in the background or the bookcase. And then I did the opposite in the lower one. I decided the baby was the primary focus and monkey wasn't. It takes a little bit of working in this mode to get the focus and how much focus you want. And you can see the difference of the primary picture in the left and the upper right. I even blurred the baby a little bit more than in the primary one. And again, you can add the blur afterwards. You can do it while you're taking pictures. But thinking portrait mode, it's just like food mode. A portrait can be a portrait of a picture. It can be a portrait of a rock. You can play with these portraits and decide you're going to use these modes in other ways once you know what the camera is capable of doing. All right, let's talk video. All the cameras have different videos. And so there's 2 dimensions of videos that you have as options for video. And this is true in your regular cameras too. There's the resolution, which is the FHD is 1920 by 180. Those are the megapixels. 4K, which is talked about a lot, is 380 40 by 2160. And then 8K, which is what they're advertising in the Samsung and the newer, I think, iPhones, and also some of the newer mirrorless cameras have this 8K video, which is a whopping, huge amount of resolution. So the resolution matters only if you're planning to crop your video. 4K is adequate. 8K, 1 minute is 600 megabytes. It's like huge. And so I did run the Galaxy at 8K just to figure it out. And what it was running is it was also running a frame rate of 24 frames per second. So the other thing that happens with video is it's the amount of resolution, how big it is if you were going to freeze it. And most of our televisions aren't even 8K. You can't even see 8K. But frame rate also is an option you have in your video, and that's the number of frames it's taking per second. And if you remember the old times of the first motion video that you had, if you went to an old museum, were these cards of the same picture taken, and you flip them, and the quicker you flip them, the less jittery that video looked. Or the early Charlie Chaplin movies, the frame rate was really slow on those. So as the frame rate increases, it's smoother in terms of the look of the video. Most Hollywood film that we're used to is filmed at 24 frames per second. We're used to seeing in major motion pictures a little bit of a flicker. We've got accustomed to it, but as you go up in your frame rate, that flicker is going to decrease. You're going to get more frames, but the more frames you have a second, the more memory you need to have in your camera. So what do I default on my iPhone? I would default at the UHD 4K, if I had the option, 24 frames a second. So what I want is I want the resolution, and I will decrease the number of frames a second. Now, if I'm taking pictures of hummingbirds, I might up the frames per second. That's the decision I'm going to make. And each of your cameras and your phones will have different options in terms of how many frames per second and what the resolution is of the video. So again, 24 frames a second gives you that cinematic flicker. 30 frames per second is what most social media is, and 60 frames per second is if you have sports and action. But you have to have good lighting, because the more frames you have a second, the more blur you're going to have if your lighting isn't good for shooting. And this is an example of a freeze frame of if you were at the full high definition versus the ultra high. And you can just see in the lighthouse example, the more frames you have, the more dynamic range you're going to have, the more detail you're going to have. And the reason this becomes important is that I oftentimes will pull still images from my camera phone video. Particularly, I love taking pictures of hummingbirds and butterflies by running video and then extracting frames of it from my cell phone, or even from my regular cameras. So one exercise you can do is to take your camera, lie on the floor, and try to be level, and take a picture of a ceiling fan. If you don't have ceiling fans, regular fans, anything that's moving, and set it at your different rates and see what you like and for what different reasons. So this one, you can see this was at the highest setting, and it's pretty smooth. If I had done it at less frames per second, it would be a more choppy picture, and it may be choppy on streaming on Zoom. But there's not a whole lot of distortion, but play with it so you get to know your video. And that's true of your camera phones and also your regular phones if you want to start running video. So what's important is that you're able to organize and find your pictures. In the Androids, most of where you find your pictures is called a gallery. And your gallery will come up with different types of organizations. It will have pictures, it will have all albums, and they even, on this Android I had, it had stories, and it had it took all the pictures of my cat and it said an adorable pictures or something, and it made a story, and it actually made a video out of that story. You can also, if you hit on this Android, if you went to search, it would say, what do you want to search? And it gave me options of types of searches. Do I want a selfie? Do I want a motion picture? I could even type in cat and it would try to find all the pictures of cats. But the important thing is to go in and to create albums, because nothing's more annoying than somebody standing there saying, oh, I have this picture I want to show you. So from your gallery, if you go in, once you get into the gallery, you can go in and pick the pencil as your editing tool. And everyone might have it a little bit different depending on your software. And the heart is something you can have as your favorite. The dots with the other dots coming from it is sharing. The all important delete button. And then the 3 dots also lets you have different options. You can move it to an album, you can copy it, and different types of things. Whenever you see 3 dots, click on it and see what options you have. So I want to talk a little bit about editing. This was a picture that I took from the Galaxy. And if you look on the left, that was before I edited it under the word editing in black and white. And I found the colors to be a little bit saturated. And to me, this really called for changing it to black and white to really just deal with the contrast and the tones. And then I cropped it more. I wanted to get rid of the fence line in the front and crop it more 16:9. And it just has a whole different feel to the picture. So again, on this device, it was the pencil that allowed me to get into the cropping. And this was taken with the Galaxy, with the 10x zoom. And so the first thing I always do is go in and decide what my crop is going to be. And when you click the crop tool, it was automatically said free, but I wanted to do a standard crop. So I picked 3:4. So if you click, the reason to do standard crop is if you ever think you might want to print it, but you can also do free crops. You can also change the angle of it. You can select with this dash thing, you can turn it around, you can flip it. There's different things you can do with crop, but that's one of the first things that I'll do is crop the picture. The overlapping circles are filters, and you can pick different filters. You can create your own filters in this device, and you can also download additional filters from, and sometimes I'll start by looking at the filters and see, do I like a filter, or do I want to do my editing myself? And on this device, what allowed me to get into the different edits was the this little symbol here. And the edit tools that were on this device were brightness, which is the overall, just how bright the image is, exposure, which adjusts both the highlights and the shadows at the same time, contrast, which is the difference between the highlights and the shadows. What I tend to do is skip over and adjust my highlights and shadows first, and then go back and do contrast. I oftentimes find that just brightening up the highlights or making more shadows can change the picture. Whereas if you do exposure, it will do both of them together. Saturation is just how saturated the colors are. If I want the red belly's head to be more red, I can add saturation. You have to be very, very careful adding saturation. It can look artificial. A lot of the landscapes that I see are just totally overly saturated. tint usually doesn't work all that well. It's going to change the reds and the greens. And white balance, there you might want to change it and make it more cool if you have snow, more red if you have a sunset. But I found compared to the iPhone that there's just a limit to what editing you can do. So given that this is an Android device, I highly recommend you can do your first edits here, but play with Snapseed if you want to do more fine editing on the device. They also have these little stickers you can add and silly things that are not of interest to me. And then you can save or discard your changes. What I couldn't figure out is how to do a save as a copy. So if you're editing, before you do that, you should go into your gallery, click on those three dots and make a copy. You can always discard and cancel that if it's sitting there, but I always like to keep the original before I mess with it. So getting back to editing, you can do captures from your videos. And this is, I do this a lot. I do this with birds. I do it with butterflies. I do it with hummingbirds. And the version of Android I had is if you're in a video and you tap on it to stop it, it allowed me to have this icon that took a screen capture. And I don't know if all of the Androids have it or if it's just the more current ones. If not, there are different ways to do screen captures. And if I was going to do a screen capture of this, I would turn the phone and rotate it so it was horizontal so that the picture was bigger and taking up more of the screen. I can also do a screen capture by pressing the volume and the side button together. But I was finding that a lot of times the volume control was coming up as I was doing it. It took some practice to do that. And then the advantage of having this feature on the latest Galaxy was that it would take the screen capture, and whether I had the phone horizontal or vertical, it would get rid of all the controls and the other things that were on the screen. It was just extracting a frame. So I can do it with pressing the volume control and the side button at the same time. You have to practice doing that to get it, not to turn the device off, but to do a screen capture. And then it went into the gallery there was a gallery folder that said screenshots. The other thing that this Android had in the directory was, and this was not in the camera one, this was in the main settings directory. There's something called motions and gestures. And what I found with the Android devices, the latest ones, that there's a lot you can do with motions and gestures. So there was the ability to do a palm swipe across the screen to get a screen capture. And again, this takes some getting used to too, but holding the phone, what I could do is if this was the phone, I have my screen's opposite.
I don't know where the hell you are.
What you do is you just sweep the phone, your palm across it if you have that option. And again, it takes some practice to do. But what I find is for motion and for some of the distance, the videos are so clear that it was far better to do the captures than to try to zoom in using the zoom. And again, the video allows you to crop the video. You can change with the scissors where the video stops and starts. There are filters you can do. So you can see on this screen, I cropped it. I made it a little bit more reddish. You can also add text and music with your video editor. And then again, if you want to do more advanced editing, I highly recommend Snapseed. And Snapseed will integrate really well because it is an Android Google product.